Good evening, folks, and welcome to tonight's class. I am Rabbi Arnie Samlan. I go by the blogger name, the notorious RAV, and you have my bio information that came along with your invitation to tonight. I work at the Jewish Education Project in New York. I'm also founder of a new venture that I call Jewish Connectivity, which is available on Facebook and also on Twitter. And I am also a fan of PunkTorah. As Patrick and Michael will tell you, I was involved as the project manager for the Jewish Futures Conference last year, at which Patrick and Michael were presenters, and very quickly came to appreciate the work that PunkTorah does in the community, and I'm very happy that you're joining us this evening. We'll be looking at some text together in the box that you're viewing this through. You can download the notes and the text that we'll be looking at tonight. And this is my first time using the software, so I'm very much appreciative of Patrick's coaching through this, which he's been doing in chat and also in some private messages to me. And to let you know that if you have input, any questions, comments, criticisms, jokes, anything else, please share them in the chat window. I'll be looking at the chat window and trying to respond as quickly as possible to any questions that arise. So once again, welcome and thank you for the opportunity for us to study some Torah together. I'm going to begin by speaking a bit about what the Talmud is. And for some of you, no doubt that will be a review. For others of you, it will be either new information or information that may be different based on my interpretation and understanding. And if at any point there's anything unclear, please just jump in. So this evening's session on sex in the Talmud also is being called prohibited Talmud, and I want to talk a bit about what that means. When we speak about something being prohibited, interestingly enough, it usually doesn't mean that it gets erased from the text. We do have texts in the Torah, in Talmud, throughout Jewish literature that are either difficult or that in many cases are simply not taught publicly, either because they're controversial or because they may involve information that is considered somehow inappropriate for the audience. So my first experience in studying Talmud was in high school in Chicago, and there were certain texts which for some reason were included in our school's curriculum, and yet we would get to a certain point in the text and the rabbi or teacher would just say, we're going to skip over this now. And most notably that would occur when there was something of a sexual nature. Now, it's worth asking why you would teach a tractate of Talmud that involves sexual information to a group of teenage boys to begin with, if you're going to end up skipping it. But nonetheless, that was a part of our school's curriculum, and that was how it was handled. In certain cases, these texts would be taught to us, and we were being taught by rabbis who, in many cases, were European trained, older gentlemen for the most part, and the sense of propriety, both on their parts as well as in society in those days, was that you simply don't use words when referring to sex like oral or anal. And nonetheless, that was exactly what was being discussed in some of these parts of the Talmud that we were studying. So instead, the rabbi would hem and haw and say something like, well, it means unusual sex. The actual Hebrew phrase was bia shalo kedarka, relations that were in a way that is not typical. And we glossed over it. Being teenage boys, we had our guesses as to what that meant, but never any way of really checking it out or confirming it. So tonight, we're going to look at a few of those kinds of texts that were skipped over in yeshivot, skipped over in the day school world, and that nonetheless are very much a part of our teachings. So a quick word about what Talmud is. We're going to be looking at texts in the Hebrew. The languages of the Talmud are both, we'll be looking at it in the English. The languages of the Talmud are Hebrew, particularly in what's called the Mishnah, which is an early part of Talmudic literature, and in Aramaic, which was the vernacular at that time, was most likely the language in which Jesus spoke and preached in, and it was certainly the language of common discussion among the Jews, especially in Babylonia, but also in the land of Israel. Talmud was written in two different versions. There was a version that was edited in Babylonia, and a similar yet somewhat different version that was edited in Israel, and most typically in the Galilee. Tiberias, for those of you who've been to Israel, seems to have been the strong point of where Talmudic literature was being discussed and studied. It was also a city of mysticism at that time and also much later. And many of the rabbis of the Talmud indeed are buried in the area of Tiberias. The period in which the Talmud was being written was between the 2nd and 5th or 6th centuries, and what we would call Judaism today was being born. Until that time, if you go back into the biblical period, well, we were a nationality, we had laws, there was no idea of separation of church and state. Simply, whatever you did as a member of the nation Israel. The punishments that were given for violations of laws were given by courts, whether the laws being violated were ritual laws, whether they were civil laws, whether they involved marital law. The same courts were taking care of it. The same king was the king of Israel for both parts, and there were those areas of ritual life that were dictated by the priestly class, by the Kohanim. There were also teachers who were prophets, Nevi'im, and everyone lived together in some degree of separation of church and state, separation of powers, rather. Separation between the priests and the kings and the prophets, and every once in a while they got on each other's nerves and tried to keep each other honest. During the time of the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, which is actually a time period that we commemorate at this season of the year, we went from being this nationality to suddenly becoming a religion. No one until that time had really spent a lot of energy on figuring out what happens to the people of Israel when there isn't a king. What happens to the people of Israel when there's not a temple and when we're not going to be offering sacrifices? Suddenly, all of these questions come into play. And the rabbis, and rabbi itself was a new designation, came around and determined that through a series of conversations, formal as well as informal, it was time to take the people of Israel from being a nationality to being what we would now call a religious group, a religious civilization. All of a sudden, we were taking Torah out of the land of Israel and moving it into what we now call the galut, the dispersion, the diaspora, the greater world. Jerusalem was no longer going to be the center of Jewish life. Jewish life during this period moved around to different cities the ancient city of Yavne being one of them, and Tiberias, which we spoke about earlier. Mitzvah, the idea that there were commandments in the Torah, was now being transformed into what we would call halacha, the way, or the practice of Judaism in very specific terms. There were no longer prophets, there were now rabbis, there were no longer kings, there was something called an exilarch who was more or less the director or head of the community in exile. The reading of Torah was going to now happen in synagogues. There was a whole prayer service that was beginning to develop. The first prayer book comes in around the 7th or 8th century. And there is a period of several centuries of huge creativity. And I would almost say that the period of creativity that we're now experiencing in Jewish life in America in many ways was the same. In the middle of this, the documents that recorded the minutes of the conversations and set down some of the practices as well as some of the superstitions and many other bodies of information became known as the Talmud. The Mishnah, very brief and short descriptions of what Jewish practice should be, and the Gemara, more lengthy stream of consciousness conversations about anything that a Jewish person might be thinking about. Sometimes it related to the Mishnah, but oftentimes it drifted far from that original subject. What we're going to be looking at today are selections from the Gemara. The selections will deal with how sexuality was addressed in that time. You're probably going to find that assumptions that you had will be challenged. And again, questions or comments, please feel free to share them in the chat window, and I will respond as soon as possible. And also, you can use that space to speak among yourselves. So with that, we're going to begin in a second. And I invite you to open the English text that is in that download the notes section. And we'll be starting together. Okay, the first text we're looking at is from a book, a tractate, called Brachot. Brachot, as the name indicates, deals with blessings. And blessings and prayer in general was really just taking shape during this time period. And there are a series of discussions about all sorts of blessings and prayers. Remember, this is several hundred years before the first written, edited, modern Siddur is being written down. So everything is in a transitional, developmental kind of stage at this point in history. The text begins like this. It has been taught. Rabbi Akiba said. Rabbi Akiba, for those of you who don't know, is one of the first generations of Talmudic teachers. He appears in the Mishnah as well as in the Gemara. Rabbi Akiba is quoted as having said, "Once I went in after Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Yehoshua, to a privy, to a bathroom, and I learned three things from him. First, I learned that one does not sit east and west, but north and south. Second, I learned that one evacuates not standing, but sitting. Third, I learned that it is proper to wipe with the left hand and not with the right." Ben Azai, another one of the sages of that time, said, "Did you dare to take such liberties with your master?" He replied, "It was Torah, and I am required to learn." So what this is telling us is that to the rabbis of the Talmud, not only was the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, considered to be Torah, but even the everyday behavior of rabbis, of Jewish leaders, was considered to be Torah, something we all were going to learn from. The next incident begins as follows. It has been taught, Ben Azai said, once I went in after Rabbi Akiva to a privy, and I learned 3 things from him. I learned that one does not evacuate east and west, but north and south. I learned that one evacuates sitting and not standing. I learned it is proper to wipe with the left hand and not with the right. Rabbi Judah said to him, did you dare to take such liberties with your master? He replied, it was a matter of Torah, and I am required to learn. Now, this is pretty much the same story repeated, except that it's now going 1 generation later, and the same incident and the same teachings occur. Now we're going to get to the part that deals with sexuality. Rabbi Kahana, once went in and hid under Rab's bed. He heard him chatting with his wife and joking and doing what he required. He said to him, one would think that Abba's mouth had never sipped the dish before. In other words, that the rabbi had not had sexual relations in so long. He, Rab, said to him, Kahana, are you here? Go out, because it is rude. He replied to him, it is a matter of Torah, and I am required to learn. So I would say, and I'm not used to teaching without any response, so again, please feel free to post your responses publicly in the chat room in OneShul and PunkTorah. What it seems to be is that the attitude towards sexuality and towards even a certain amount of privacy that we have today was not necessarily part of the Talmudic world. The idea that a Talmudic scholar could hide under his teacher's bed, and Lord knows I would not have wanted to hide under any of my teachers' beds to see what was going on, and certainly hope none of my students want to do that either. Nonetheless, it seems that at that time, this particular student at least was not put off by any issues of privacy or personal space, nor was either he or his rabbi particularly put off by having conversations about sexuality between them. I think this is a very important text to enlighten us as to what the attitude of Judaism was, or at least of Talmudic Judaism, towards sexuality. Many of our attitudes towards sexuality are not inherently Jewish. Many of them really crept into Judaism by way of Protestantism and groups within Christianity. They sometimes crept in actually through certain mystical or Kabbalistic texts, but certainly if one goes back to biblical literature, the Tanakh, the Bible, is very open about its character's sexuality. It discusses rape, seduction very openly. It discusses Judah, the founder of one of the tribes, going and picking up a prostitute or someone he believes to be a prostitute at the side of the road. And there's no censorship. The censorship occurred by the time I was in Hebrew school, and found that in the Torah book that we used in our Hebrew school, that particular incident about Judah, Yehudah, was conspicuously left untranslated from Hebrew to English. So somewhere in there, the Jewish attitudes towards sexuality and towards speaking about sex changed drastically. If we want proof of that, you could also look at Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, which is virtually a pornographic book if it's read literally. It was so detailed and specific about sexual conversations that there had even been conversation in the Talmudic period as to whether it should be included in the biblical canon, included in the Tanakh. And there were even some limitations that were going to be placed on who it could be taught to and under what circumstances. So whether we read the Song of Songs as an analogy, which is what some publishers have chosen to do, for instance, Art Scroll Publications doesn't even do a literal translation of the book. They actually do a metaphor translation. And whether we accept the book as pure metaphor, or whether we say, as some scholars have said, for instance, the Blocks of California, who did a recent modern translation, they simply said that it was not uncommon for texts about sexuality to be included in all sorts of early religious canons, early religious writings, not only in the Jewish tradition, but in other religions and other cultures as well. So, in either case, Shir HaShirim does show up, the Song of Songs, and the conversation here shows up in Talmudic literature, except when it's skipped over in the school that I went to. So that is text 1. Once again, any questions, comments, or conversations, please go ahead and post in the chat room. So far, it seems pretty quiet in there, which is unusual in any case for any group of Jewish people together, that level of quiet. So please feel free to converse in there. Okay, if there are no objections, we'll go ahead into text number 2. All right, here we're looking at a text in Menachot, a different tractate of the Talmud. And we'll find a rather fascinating story there. It was taught, Rabbi Nathan said, there is not a single precept in the Torah, even the lightest, whose reward is not enjoyed in this world. And as to its reward in the future world, I do not know how great it is. So now the text goes on and says, go and learn this from the mitzvah, from the precept of tzitzit. Tzitzit, for those of you who are not familiar, is that according to Jewish tradition, on any significantly sized four-cornered garment, there must be fringes attached. In ancient times, and also among some people, including myself, one of the strands would be a blue string to remind us of the heaven and therefore to also remind us of God. But at a certain point, when the dye that was used either became too rare and or became too expensive, it was simply replaced with all white tzitzit, all white fringes. Tzitzit were worn traditionally only by men, although I do know women who wear either tzitzit or a talit, which is a version of tzitzit. So, back to our text. We learned from the precept of tzitzit. Once a man who was very scrupulous about the precept of tzitzit. Quick side comment here, it will be shown shortly that he wasn't just a plain old gentleman, but was a student of the sages. Back to the text. He heard of a certain harlot, a certain prostitute, in one of the towns by the sea, who accepted 400 gold dinarim. Dinar was both a weight and a type of coin, and it was pretty expensive. She accepted that amount for her hire. So we are talking about a pretty high-priced call girl. He sent her 400 gold dinarim and appointed a day with her. He made an appointment. When the day arrived, he came and waited at her door. And her maid came and told her, that man who sent you 400 gold dinarim is here and waiting at the door. To which she replied, let him come in. When he came in, she prepared for him 7 beds, 6 of silver and 1 of gold. And between one bed and the other there were steps of silver, but the last were of gold. She went up to the top bed and lay upon it naked. So he too went up after her in his desire to sit naked with her, when suddenly the 4 fringes, the tzitzit, of his garment struck him across the face. Whereupon he slipped off and sat upon the ground. She also slipped off and sat upon the ground and said, by the Roman capital, I will not leave you alone until you tell me what blemish you saw in me. By the Roman capital seems to be a way of taking an oath or swearing, and she's simply saying, I am not leaving here and not stopping until you tell me what you saw in me that caused you this level of grief. By the temple, the man replied, never have I seen a woman as beautiful as you are. But there is one precept, one mitzvah, which the Lord our God has commanded us. It is called tzitzit, and with regard to it, the expression, I am the Lord your God, is twice written, signifying that I am God who will exact punishment in the future, and I am God who will reward in the future. The tzitzit appeared to me as 4 witnesses who were testifying against me. By the way, I don't know whether any of you know, but in a criminal case or any case, there are how many witnesses generally required? Anyone want to type the answer in? Okay, so there would have been 2. And indeed, what's happening here is that we seem to have double the amount of witnesses that are actually needed. Excuse me, I'm just updating my chat window again. I seem to have accidentally closed it. Okay, back in business. Okay, one moment. Oops. Okay, I'm back with you. So now, he responded that he had not simply 2 witnesses, but 4 witnesses who were testifying against him. The 2 that were required and 2 additional witnesses. So he's in double trouble here. She said, I will not leave you until you tell me your name, the name of your town, the name of your teacher, and the name of the school in which you study Torah. The Talmud appears to protect the identity of this man, but he wrote it down and handed it to her on a note. Thereupon she arose and divided her estate, all of her belongings, into 3 parts. 1/3 for the government, 1/3 to be distributed among the poor, and 1/3 she took with her in her hand. The bedclothes, however, she retained. Now, having this information with her, she continues to the study hall, the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Chia, and says to him, Master, give me instructions about me, that they may make me a proselyte, a convert to Judaism, or as I prefer to look at it, a naturalized Jew. My daughter, he said, perhaps you have set your eyes on one of these students, one of the disciples. Now, it's interesting here that in traditional Judaism, or at least in some forms of traditional Judaism, a convert was not accepted or would be looked down upon if he or she was becoming Jewish on behalf of a partner. Here, however, that does not seem to be bothering the rabbis in this text. So she takes out the piece of paper and indeed hands it to Rabbi Chia. Not written in the text is that it's very clear that Rabbi Chia has read the name of his somewhat wayward student, and curiously enough, in no way castigates the student or finds this terribly unusual. He replied to her, "Go and enjoy your acquisition." This certainly would appear to mean that in some way there was some type of conversion or naturalization to Judaism that took place in there, in spite of the way their relationship began, which was going to be a client or customer prostitute relationship. The very bedclothes which she had spread for him for an illicit purpose, she now spread out for him lawfully. This is the reward of a mitzvah in this world. And as for its reward in the future world, Olam Haba, I do not know how great it is. Now, even though ostensibly this text was talking about tzitzit, it gives us, again, tremendous insight into the world of the rabbis and of ancient Judaism, just as happened in the book of Genesis, where the Torah does not shy away from telling us that Yehudah, Judah, was out looking to make use of a prostitute. The Talmud doesn't shy away from it as well, and even Rabbi Chia, the teacher of this particular student, doesn't hesitate, doesn't take time to criticize the student, doesn't seem shocked by it. And while we don't know that this is the entire conversation, this nonetheless gives us a sense of the acceptability or the attitude and the fact that this was not considered to be so far out of line. And on the contrary, this prostitute is accepted with open arms into the Jewish community and handed over to Rabbi Chia's student to marry, and they live happily ever after. I also find very interesting this whole idea that the bedclothes, which can either mean bedclothes or could be the sheets or bedding, that was hers during her days of prostitution, now, as a result of her conversion and as a result of their making kosher their relationship, those become now the bedclothes of mitzvah. They become the apparel and the bedding that's used when fulfilling the mitzvah of procreation, of having sexual relations with one's partner, one's spouse. So we see in here even the idea that simply because something was used for a purpose that was unlawful doesn't mean that it cannot be converted into something lawful. Actually, in other places, this idea that Malin B'Kodesh, we can raise something's sanctity up but we can't decrease it, becomes a general rule in Talmud. And Sid K5, thank you so much for that comment that you wrote, that you love the story, and it's such an awesome story to be in Talmud. And again, Talmudic literature is like that. A person can simply be cruising along, minding their own business, reading a seemingly innocent conversation, and then there'll be a side conversation that comes in. This is typical of Talmud. It was also somewhat typical of some of the Greek symposia in which the intellectuals would gather at that time. And so you see this happening not only in Talmud, but in something like the Haggadah for Passover, where there's a certain amount of digression that occurs. All of it based on the same way of communicating, conversing, and going off onto some sidetracks. Patrick, thank you. It seems that there were some questions that I missed along the way, so I appreciate that. So, why would rabbis today choose to make everything an analogy? I have a theory about Jewish thinking, and it really lies at the center of my Jewish connectivity venture, which is that there is a certain style of creative thinking that is somewhat unique to Judaism, that causes us to move seamlessly from subject to subject and from concrete to metaphor or analogy. That happens very frequently. The entire Midrash, which are commentaries in the Bible, is all essentially analogy and metaphor, or a good amount of it at least. We also know from the way that adults learn, from modern study of adult learning, that adults learn much better with the use of metaphor and analogy. And there is a lot of research that's been done that actually backs that up. So again, in this case, what happens is that we are treated to this whole conversation between prostitute and potential client simply because the Talmud wanted to say that you just never know what the reward or punishment for a mitzvah might be. Patrick, you also mentioned Park Lane 47. Is there a biblical distinction between the right and left hand? Yes. Not necessarily with regard to the hand that one wipes with after going to the bathroom, and not even with regards to tefillin, to the leather straps and texts that are wrapped on one arm. However, there are some places in which it refers to either the right hand or the left hand, or people not knowing their left hand from their right shows up in biblical literature. It does become more pronounced in Talmudic literature, and just full disclosure, I am a left-handed person. I get very upset with people who provide only for right-handed people and options, but as a left-handed person, I will tell you that the hand with which most legal transactions take place by Talmudic law is the right hand. Okay, Sid, I'm going to take the liberty of reading what you wrote here, a story about bringing holiness to an unholy situation. Going to a porn store just there, and a woman came up, and you ended up rescuing a battered woman. And I think that is a fascinating story indeed. Interestingly enough, the rabbis of mysticism, of Kabbalah, talked about how sometimes in order to rescue the scattered sparks of holiness that are scattered all over the world, one sometimes needs to descend into lower places, into a lower level of holiness in order to rescue holy sparks that may be hidden there. So Sid K5, I would say you actually fulfilled the Kabbalistic idea of Tikkun Olam, of bringing together divine sparks that somehow got buried amidst the schmutz, amidst the unholiness of a part of the world. So, kol hakavod to you. Jeremiah, the king in the Bible, you asked an excellent question there. That was Ehud ben Gera, who was actually, if I remember correctly, not technically a king, but was one of the chieftains, or the shoftim in Hebrew, sometimes known as the chiefs, or chieftains, or judges. And he did rule, and indeed, when he goes in to see the enemy king, he happens to be left-handed. The enemy king's people, his guards, in a sense, the Transportation Safety Authority, are looking on his left side to see if he's armed, because one takes out the sword and with their strong hand reaches across their body to draw it. And indeed, because he was left-handed, his weapon was on his right side. And he does pull out the weapon. He sneaks it into the castle, as it were. The king who is there rises, because Ehud says to him, I have a gift for you from God. I have a word from God. And at that point, Ehud draws his sword and kills him. Sin? Yeah. I really appreciate what it is you're saying. I think, again, what it is, I'm not necessarily encouraging people to go to their local porn store, although we will see in a moment that the question of whether one can would be an interesting question to ask, and under what circumstances. However, I think that idea that one can be in a situation that doesn't feel like a sanctuary by any means, and perform a mitzvah that simply comes to hand is an amazing, amazing experience. And thank you for sharing that. I did see a little bit further up conversation about feminist conversation. So the Talmud, as well as biblical literature, did recognize the right to a man to have sex with someone other than one wife, that one could have more than one wife, polygamy, that there were concubines, at least in biblical period, and basically concubines, when one thinks about it, is a form of legal, I would consider it to be somewhat a form of legalized prostitution, albeit that concubine is yours, is not shared. But we do have to recognize that it was both a reflection on what society looked like at that time, as well as a reflection that these texts were written by men. Yeah, I see there's a continued conversation about that. So I would say yes, there is a definite difference between a prostitute and a slave. Slavery in biblical law was a somewhat respected position. It was not a lifetime commitment. It was viewed as something that would happen as one was working off a debt. It could be punishment for a crime or a civil case, and was a temporary situation. Prostitution, while outlawed by the Torah, nonetheless existed, and that person is seemingly free to pursue her occupation. One of the interesting situations in the Bible is in the book of Joshua, where spies are sent out to spy out the land of Israel, and they hide in the house of Rachav, who is referred to as a zonah. The word zonah usually means a prostitute. There are those biblical commentators who think that in this case the word zonah actually means an innkeeper, from the word mazon, one who provides food and rest, but it isn't actually clear. I'm going to just very quickly respond to the conversion question, which goes back to the earlier texts. There are very few, if any, limitations placed on a convert. According to traditional Judaism, a convert is not, a convert cannot become a priest, cannot become a Kohen, and cannot become the king, the Melech. There is some question, actually, in contemporary Judaism. In traditional Judaism, a female convert could not marry a Kohen, a priest, because, at least in ancient times, there was some question of the moral character that woman had had before she became Jewish. And that has become a bone of contention among some of the movements in modern Judaism. As to the social position of a woman, there is no question that a woman's role and her rights in Judaism developed over the course of many centuries. The Talmud actually uses the phrase niknate, a kinyan, that is to say a legal transaction occurs when a woman becomes a wife, and it does seem to indicate a lowered position. On the other hand, she is given certain rights through the ketubah, again a rabbinic invention, that certainly raise her above simply a chattel position. So again, that's a situation that evolves and continues to evolve even in contemporary Judaism. And we have to look in, as we look at our texts, while it's great for us to be able to sit where we are and judge what society was like in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, the fact is that the world around our people will look very different then. And we were, to some extent, the reflection of that society. Judaism changes, and the world around us has changed, and I think that's a reality that we have to look at. So let's go on with the third text, again from Tractate Nedarim, and I thank you for your patience as I went back to these questions. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahabai said, the Malachei HaSharet, the ministering angels. And we know, of course, that there are angels in Jewish tradition. It's the subject of the song Shalom Aleichem on Friday nights, traditionally. The ministering angels, the Rabbi Yochanan said, told me 4 things. People are born lame because they overturned their table. They, meaning their parents. And overturning the table is a very graphic way of seemingly referring to presumably anal sex. I had a table, it was turned over. They're born dumb because they kiss that place. That place is presumably the vaginal area. Blind because they look at that place. Now that is the end of the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. Probably we should put a paragraph break right over there. But this contradicts the following. Ima Shalom was asked. And Ima Shalom, as the name would indicate, is a woman. She is actually both the sister and daughter of leadership of those days. She was asked, why are your children so exceedingly beautiful? She answered, because my husband converses with me, and converses in quotes, seemingly this is having sexual relations, neither at the beginning nor at the end of the night, but only at midnight. When he converses, he uncovers a handbreadth and covers a handbreadth. So this may actually be the origin of the untrue urban legend that extremely religious Jews have sexual relations through a sheet with a hole in it, which is totally untrue. But this is a part of what they apparently did, was simply to uncover the parts that were going to be used. And the text continues, it is as though he were compelled by a demon. And that again goes back to our earlier text in which the rabbi is referred to as being particularly, what's the word I'm looking for, spunky and energetic in his sexual relations. When I asked him, she continues, what is the reason for this, for choosing midnight? He replied, so that I may not think of any other woman, lest my children be as bastards. So two things are happening here. One is that she is really teaching us something about how a person should be focused on their partner and not on anyone else. At the same time, this gives us a bit of contradiction between Rabbi Yochanan, who seems to be very limited by what is permitted, and Ima Shalom, who seems to say that while there's some hesitation about complete nudity, they're pretty open about what's going on sexually, and there's a lot of, he takes her as a demon, compelled by a demon, a lot of action. The Talmud continues, there is no difficulty. This refers to conjugal matters, the other refers to other matters. The distinction and difference between the two has to do with what it is they're reflecting on. Now it gets even more interesting and more direct. Rabbi Yochanan said, the above is the view of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahabai. Okay, those are two different Rabbi Yochanans. Our sages, however, and whenever it says our sages, it means this is the majority opinion, and generally this becomes written down as Jewish law. Sid, no, it doesn't mean they actually are considered bastards. It means as if. It's a way of simply saying that there's some impurity in their conception. It doesn't actually put them into the legal category of bastards, of mamzerim. It's a good question. So our sages, the rabbis, the majority say the halacha, Jewish practice, is not like the strict opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahabai, but a man may do whatever he pleases with his wife. This, by the way, becomes written down hundreds of years later by Maimonides, Rambam, and while some later authorities tend to limit that, there is indeed what to rely upon here, and it seems to allow pretty much all positions and any practices that wouldn't be forbidden for other reasons, causing injury, disrespecting another person, and the like. One of the questions that I personally have with this text, it says a man may do whatever he pleases with his wife, and what's not clear from the text, or maybe is clear and I'm not totally comfortable with it, is that it seems to allow for the possibility that the woman doesn't get to choose or get to say no. And again, that's not directly stated in the text, but it's a question that disturbs me with the text. Great question, Park Lane. I was wondering about that today as well. So there's no evidence that it would have been permitted. And again, I think that texts that talked about concentrating on one's partner would probably limit that and discourage that at the very least, if not outright outlaw it. And that's probably the best answer I can give to you. It's a great question, and I appreciate your asking it. Now, a parable. And this goes back to Patrick, you're asking about analogies and parables. meat which comes from the abattoir, meat that comes from being prepared from the freezer, from the fridge, from the oven, may be eaten salted, roasted, cooked, or seethed. So with fish from the fishmonger. So in other words, what they're saying, to try to now put it in a more clean and metaphoric language, is that sexuality, just like food, can be indulged with in many different ways. It doesn't only have to be one way. A Maimar said, who are the ministering angels? This is going back to the beginning of our texts. The rabbis. For should you maintain it literally, why did Rabbi Yochanan say the halacha is not as Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahabai? After all, the angels know more about the formation of the fetus than we do. So why, the Talmud asks, are the rabbis referred to as ministering angels? Because they, the sages, the rabbis, are as distinguished as them, the angels. Now the last part of our text. A woman came before Rebbe, one of the great scholars at that time, and said, Rabbi, I set a table before my husband, but he overturned it. Once again, this is metaphor, rather comical metaphor, for I was ready for presumably vaginal sex, and instead he turned me over. Rabbi replied, my daughter, the Torah permits you to him. What then can I do for you? In other words, while you're complaining that this bothered you in some way, since the Torah permits it, I cannot intervene. Now again, while I'm disturbed about this from a women's right perspective, at the same time, the prevailing belief or attitude that any type of sexuality other than vaginal sex, etc., is prohibited is really a false assumption. Rav replied, a woman once came before Rav and complained, Rabbi, I set the table before my husband, but he overturned it. Rav replied, how does that differ from a fish, which, as we said earlier, the law permits to be prepared in any way? So once again, the idea that just like you need variety in your diet, you need a certain amount of variety in your sexual practice, and that indeed is what the Talmud has to say. A strict daily focus per partner. Sid, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, but it certainly would seem to be within the realm of possibility that a man could go from partner to partner, even within the same day, as long as he's able to concentrate on that particular partner. Incidentally, later halacha, later Jewish law, and again, remembering that most works of Jewish law were written by men and largely for men, later works of Jewish law are actually very directive in suggesting that a man needs to be careful to give his partner pleasure. So that's important to know. I want to thank you all for participating in this. I know our time is just about up. This has been my first time teaching for PunkTorah and OneShul. I've enjoyed it very much. It's really been my pleasure. If any other questions come up, I'm more than happy to respond to them by email or through OneShul. Want to remind you of a few things. First of all, I am volunteering my time to the nice folks at PunkTorah. It is my pleasure to do so and to provide this kind of service with them. And the good folks at PunkTorah ask you and remind you to make donations to help provide these kinds of services. and to help keep them in business. It really is an important service being provided and attracting a lot of very nice traffic and great people to come together and study in this kind of way. So we do encourage you to support PunkTorah in any way you are able. I'm also going to give you my Twitter account so that you can follow both the work that I do in my day job, and of course PunkTorah has its own as well. What just went on there is my work Twitter, and you can use any of these Twitter accounts, Park Lane, to ask questions. If you have Twitter, if not, I can give you an email address. My Jewish Connectivity Twitter is and my own is my name, my own Twitter account. I'm also on Facebook at Arnie Samlan, and you can feel free to direct any questions or comments in that direction as well. So I thank you once again, and Patrick, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Best regards to everyone at OneShul and PunkTorah.